I've been thinking about this question of the parasites since the invitation to this workshop, and I was not an expert on Serre, and I was reading his work on the parasite, and I really found it very, very powerful to read, shocking in a sense. And what was it really he was saying in this book? And I was walking with my dog last month, and I saw this graffiti not far away from my apartment, and it says human race is a parasite. And it seemed to me that, okay, the graffiti painter kind of told me what Serre wanted to say. It's an interesting place in Copenhagen. It's one of the areas in the outskirts of the city where you don't really yet have any settlement. So it's after the end of houses and apartments, and there's like a place, a park close to the sea where nothing is really happening in a sense that no buildings. So it's just a free area, free commons. But right now, it's one of the last places in Copenhagen where you have it like that, with no urban planning, no nothing. It's not even a park, it's just like land. And now they're going to build that area and going to take it away. And in that place, the graffiti has come on. So we've been talking about Serre before, and Paul made such a clear presentation of Serre's understanding of the parasite and parasitic element and parasitic man. And that means I can just jump into it, but I'll probably just like bring out a few further aspects of what Serre's, what he wrote and how we can think with that today. So it's about the banquet, and it's about eating, as Paul also stressed this morning. And actually, interestingly, and I never thought about it before until 2 minutes ago when Janusz was talking, this focus on eating has returned during the pandemic. So it's about eating and devouring and sitting at a table. And for Serre, this is something that he analyzes with a kind of evolutionary optic, which is interesting. And he has this passage in the book where he talks about the parasitic man, and man, not woman, the gender dimension comes in, at least since agriculture and animal husbandry started. And he has this kind of opening that maybe even before among the trees, no one knows. But quite evidently for Serre, the whole book is about something that takes place after the Neolithic revolution. And it has something to do with domestication of animals and plants and human empowerment in that passage, which is normally seen as the kind of the great leap, the great progress of human beings, that we start to create civilization. But in Serre's reading, it actually turns out to become something much closer to the original sin. So this is about the banquet, it's about animals, it's about eating. And about the banquet, also one of the main reference points throughout in the book, it's Plato, who interestingly enough also has a lot of his dialogues are connected to a banquet. So here are just a few quotes from the book about this agricultural revolution that opens up a new universe, and we are the descendants of that universe. And as I said before, this is normally seen as something extremely good. We kind of lifted ourselves up from the hunter-gatherer kind of state of lower civilization to something much higher. Serre's description of this is really striking. It's violent, and it's an act of destruction in his description. The blade of the plow is a sacrificial blade. Everything here that grows here is excluded, cleaning by emptying out. You almost have the creation here of the no man's land. It's creating a tabula rasa. And then through the sacrificial knife, you manipulate the land. So this enormously violent imposition of the human being on nature, actually. And it's something that continues madly, cutting everything. Once you start the cutting, it will not stop. 1 furrow, 2 furrows, and then 1,000, so that the whole earth is cut. And so this is a description here, and it ends this one word analysis. And evidently what Sarah is on about here is that this agricultural revolution, this domestication revolution, has to do with something that profoundly touches upon how we use knowledge, how we use communication, and the birth and emergence of science, technology, and also religion, closely related to sorcery and magic, together with this process of rationalization. And of course, in all of this, the sacrificial logic pervading it all. So this threshold of evolution is the explosion of the sacrificial mechanism. And we talked about Shira before. Where is my PowerPoint? I cannot get back to my PowerPoint. Sarah is evidently drawing upon Shira, his good friend, and the mimetic violence being at play here. Now, I went away from my own PowerPoint for a second and I cannot get back to it. Federica, would you know how I can get it back? Or maybe
can you try changing window? So control right. Does that? No.
When I did it, Bjorn, I used the forward arrows on the actual screen rather than on my PowerPoint.
I changed my PowerPoint now, right?
Okay, now it works.
That's it.
Okay, there was some noise. There's the risk when you talk about this, the noise will intrude us what we're talking about. So, right. So what I also found interesting about Sarah's book is that it becomes a kind of self-reflexive attempt of a self-overcoming. He describes the parasite as an operator relation, and normally that's good to be able to relate things and communicate and to create networks is what we kind of define as being a good citizen today, but that being an operator and a relation is intrinsically problematic in Sarah's reading. And again, the network society, and he uses the word network at a moment when that was not such a common word as it is today, but you find it 23 times in the book. And Sarah is kind of reflexively also seeing that his own thinking, his own act is not away from that. He's part of that mechanism. He's part of that plot you talked about this morning, Paul, that you cannot, you are in the plot, but you cannot be. He tries to go outside the plot and look at what's happening in the plot. And he describes his own writing like the work that flows from me like honey, like the spider's web. So the trickster and creating, and with that external order, I nourished the second order. So the creation of a second order. So this is a really interesting way that he's trying to kind of say and see that our very capability to communicate with words about the world is problematic, the way we create knowledge, this creation of an external order that is somehow imposed upon a pre-existing order. And knowledge then, human knowledge, which we kind of celebrate as a great achievement, is a kind of parasitical act which is forced upon this pre-existing first order. And that's why this book also is deeply self-reflexive, and the party intruder in this case is not the parasite that comes into our bodies, but we are the parasites. And we are intruding, and what are we intruding? We are intruding in nature. So this is a very important word in Sarah's book is this irreversible, and it's kind of unidirectional act that is taking place. So we are taking our place in the world. No one asked us to come here. We're taking this place, and the flow goes one way, not the other. So we have engaged some kind of system of exchange, but what are we actually exchanging? We are exchanging logic and words for substance, and this is a problematic kind of parasitic form of exchange that ends up emptying the world of its substance. So what do we actually give back in the system of exchange? What do we give to the cow, to the tree, to the steer, and so on? All the things they give to us: milk, honey, shelter, work and food. What do we give back? We give death back. So at a certain point in Sarah's book, he clearly, and this is where he sits in this kind of like moment of epiphany, almost, that he realizes that all along the road, he didn't know this book was going to be about the evil, but the theme of evil comes out so very strongly, slowly but surely, and then still more present in the book. It's really about evil, quite simply. And then there's this substance that has been flowing from him, and I'm kind of anticipating also Agnes's paper, I guess, this effluence, the secretion that come from my fingers. He sees this kind of the insect has slowly left my room, and this is a morning in Venice, so epiphany that he's recognized the parasite and so on, but he sees that now it has left his room. Okay, really quickly, what Sarah is trying to say here, and what he dreams of, and this is what is perhaps also problematic, but he has this idea that we can try and eliminate the intermediary. And so his book is a kind of, it's an epistemology of parasites. It's a parasitical epistemology, but can then try to make another kind of philosophy, a philosophy without any interchanges, without this parasitical imposition. And that is what he's dreaming of. And jumping then to my sort of conclusion about what this is that he's dreaming of, Sarah, he became like a really strong supporter of Wikipedia. And I don't think that's a coincidence. If you look at this quote from long before the internet was even invented and it existed, Wikipedia became to Sarah that kind of thing where we can have a philosophy without any interchange. So just emphasizing again some aspects of Sarah's work and what it means today. And again, Paul's, like the characters in the film we were talking about this morning, sitting there looking for the signal. And this is really what I also read Sarah like, and I don't know any of the secondary literature about Sarah. So maybe this has all been said 20 million times. I guess it has, but you can read Sarah at many levels. It's a theory of communication. It's a philosophy of communication. It's about exchange. You can read it as a very foundational work in economic anthropology. It's about consumption, representation, but it's also a sort of anti-literum theory of the internet. And actually, some of the most interesting theories about the internet are before the internet existed. And Sarah, I would count in that category also Gabriel Tart's theory of imitation. They kind of hit it spot on before it existed. And it certainly also is a very powerful way to understand and analyze communication-driven globalization. And I see a kind of like some kind of paradox that Sarre, just like Girard, they end up in California and they kind of come to see a little bit that kind of a hope and attracted by this Californian type of globalization. But really, I would say that the internet, the network of networks, is the kind of like the ultimate end station of this parasitical mechanism that Sarre pinpoints. And he's kind of hoped that the internet will kind of take us out of that. He doesn't say that, but there are hints in that direction. It is probably very problematic. The other day I was communicating with my students, so I thought about, so Google is the kind of like really scary kind of parasitical dimension. at a level that would have been difficult to imagine just a few years ago. And the fact that when we look for information today, we actually use a verb to Google, which is the name of a company, is in effect beyond comprehension, but that is what we're doing. Let's Google it. And Google is a fascinating but also scary invention. It's a play on the term Google, which means a number of.
Thanks.
1 minute?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Okay, a number of nearly incomprehensible size. It's a 1 followed by 100 zeros, and Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they created Google to organize an infinite amount of information on the web. And if you go to Google Docs and you have just the wording of how they describe what you can do in Google Docs, create, edit online. Sarah's theory of the line actually comes in handy here to understand the very fact of online activity, and the panopticon and so on is even declared in the address, but not to go into conspiracy theory. But really what Sarah is also about is it's a theory of globalization. And he has this very powerful notion of the global without remains, which strikingly rhymes with Voegelin's notion of modernity without restraint. And this is again where he introduces the notion of the second order. It's actually also where he introduces this passage from the local to the global, a world in the universe of worlds. Power is a passage from the local to the global, and that power comes from the parasitical act. So it passes from the local to the global. And if you ever wanted to have a better definition of the internet and the theatrical aspect that Sarah is also underlying, then you can read the second paragraph on this slide. And I will just, I guess, leave it there and stop.
Thank you, Bjorn. We have 2 discussants. I'm not sure Chris is here, but we have John O'Brien and Chris Rogic for discussants. Maybe we start with John O'Brien, and if Chris is not here, then we can maybe take a question from the audience or from the other participants.
Okay, thank you very much for Bjorn. I enjoyed reading your notes. Your paper was great. I have to admit that I'm giving this response from a position of some ignorance, because I only really began engaging in Sarah's work like this week. So, I mean, I'm going to do my best, but I guess kind of offering up some of my own kind of questions and things that I'm struggling with could be useful. But I think the thing that strikes me most clearly, that comes across most clearly, and you say it very well in your paper, is this idea of the parasite, the human parasitical relationship with nature, and you can see that so clearly with the earth. You began with the banquet, and the banquet at the beginning of civilization, and it makes me think about some things that I'm naturally interested in. It made me think about the Symposium by Plato. You referenced Plato, and just some thoughts which are quite loose, but hopefully it'll come together, is the idea of, if we think about the Symposium, so the party, the feast, wine, and we think about how this kind of like is humans relating to nature in the first hand. So you have the gift of nature, which is the fruit, and the fruit contains the seeds, and it comes from the sun, and an animal eats it, and the seed goes into the earth, and it's a cycle of gift and kind of exchange and reciprocity. And then when we think about agriculture, alcohol is a very big feature of agriculture. And what that is it's us inserting ourselves as a parasite into a parasitical relationship, because you have the fruit, which is invaded by a parasite, which is bacteria, and the bacteria seeks to colonize it. But then we interject into the parasitical relationship of the bacteria with the fruit, and we then hijack that parasitically for our own end. And that kind of then makes me go into Plato's Symposium. Because when we think about when we think about Socrates is the man who cannot get drunk. So he is somehow like outside of this parasitical relationship, where there's this kind of like amplification coming from the gift of nature, where it becomes a toxin, which then provides some kind of energy, but it's not always a very positive type of energy. And so we have Socrates, who can't get drunk, but Socrates is the midwife. He's a gift giver, right? He's somebody who actually facilitates the gift and the rest of, and the reciprocal acts. And then in Plato's Symposium, so we have the other figure, the major figure, which is Alcibiades. And Alcibiades is, again, like, he's the invader. He's the parasitic invader into the party who creates noise. He's full of passion. He's full of energy, but he is kind of a hijacker. He's not only a hijacker of parties, he's a hijacker of Athens. So in terms of hijacking the Athenian body politic, and again, introducing like an awful lot of energy and noise, but then ultimately in this kind of escalating dimension where ultimately there's a collapse. So it's kind of like a long connection there, but it made me, your talk made me go all the way from like the origins of agriculture through to the banquet, through to Plato's Symposium, and how you have this kind of back and forward, or this kind of these two poles between the parasite, which seems to be kind of like the dominant thing, which is kind of fueling civilization, but then with nature, and then every now and then this figure like Socrates, who is the figure of the gift, who kind of reimposes a type of order, harmonious order, but which is always so liable to getting upset by further parasitic relations. So that was just what it brought to my mind as you were presenting, and I hope it's of some use. I thought it was very interesting. Thank you.
I would just take the comment as a very good comment. Alcibiades is mentioned continuously in Sarah's book, 23 times in fact. So he continuously returns to that noise, and the symposium is central. It's there, the symposium lurking in the background of the whole book in a sense.
Okay, if you don't want to add anything to that, Bjorn, then Chris is not here, but Arpad said he wants to make a comment.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, Chris just wrote me that he cannot be here now. It's marking time and many other things. So if possible, and maybe Paul can also drop in, because he also wrote on and had a paper on said just three very quick comments or questions. The first is it's very important Sar's point about the Neolithic, and you emphasize that very well, the Neolithic and agriculture. And I would add settlement there. So because when we talk about the parasitism of mankind, it somehow has to do with this, as you mentioned. And I would add the settlement is very important. That nobody understands why we became settled, and the settlement and city and the city rat and the country rat. So all of this is a very important problematization now in the terms of the ecological crisis of really that's a central issue. For example, viruses and bacteria. No problem outside of, before settlement and before agriculture and before then moving around of this region. It's a very important point about that. Now, my second point is that you had this huge scenery about mankind as a parasite, and in that context, it's an important point. But one has to be very careful, because it can easily be pushed into the kind of transhumanist and posthumanist kind of camp. And actually, Sarri is put into that camp, I think, quite against his better self or something like that. Bateson is put into that camp. Foucault is put into that camp. And they are not lunatic Californians who are transhumanist in that sense. So I want to make that distinction very clearly, because, again, many people push it into that direction of, we are parasite, and so we should go to the Mars or whatever that. And my third point, and this is a question, is that Sarr and Wiki, because I consider Sarr's endorsement of the Wiki and the global technology as somewhat problematic, and especially his book on the most famous book of his, or most not famous but popular book, Thumbelina. And this kind of generation of the, with the internet and everything like that, as if that would, get rid of education, something like that, because we have Wikipedia. So just as with Girard, as with Sarr, I see that even they got a little bit deflected by a kind of California mentality. Sorry about that, but you cannot keep safe if you live in California for a couple of decades. I mean, and some of Serre and some of Girard's last ideas, I think, are become a bit, colored by that. Thank you.
I think just very briefly to the second point about as this being our one and only human nature, and I think there's a critical way in which you can read Serre that way, but I think that would be wrong because evidently it is not simply the only type of human nature. It's an intrusion in the world that we need to analyze as something that is part of an evolutionary process, but which was arguably not always there. But I'll leave it at that because I see other comments and now there's Paul and Roger at least raising their hands.
Can I make a couple of observations, comments? I think, I think that Arpad is right that the settlement issue is really important, but Serre does very carefully say that this doesn't begin with the Neolithic, and he keeps open very deliberately that possibility. And when he says we don't know, I think he means quite literally we don't know, but he's certainly not saying parasitism is something that starts with the Neolithic. And I think it's quite important to sort of affirm and recognize that dimension, because for me, what's important about what Serre's doing, and Bjorn mentioned quite rightly that the word network is used multiple times throughout the book Parasite. Serre was an enormous influence on Bruno Latour, and he's a sort of hidden founding father of actor network theory, which has dominated the social sciences in the West in the last 20 or 30 years. And there's a very interesting book, Conversations between Serre and Latour, that was published in the late 80s, early 90s, I think, where Latour is very happily acknowledging all of that. And this is around the time that Serre was writing The Natural Contract, which is his sort of contribution to the ecological debates. So I think but what's lost in the translation from Michel Serre to actor network theory is the broad scope of his ontological reformulations. So Serre, as I mentioned in my talk, is very much a scientist, very much a mathematician and a polymath. So when he talks, you mentioned the multiple use of the word irreversibility in his work, the Parasite. Irreversibility really is the thermodynamic concept, where the idea is we're moving towards, if you like, entropy as the heat death of the universe. So for Serre, we start with the sun, we start with maximal energy, but nobody can live in the sun, but we end with, if you like, the depleted energy of entropy, where there's no more potential energy left. So there's two forms of death. There's death at the beginning, which is the unlivable, brutal energy of the sun, and there's death at the end, which is all of the energy has been exhausted. And life or existence exists between those two thermodynamic extremes. And it sort of organizes itself into temporary plateaus where systems can survive. But those temporary plateaus have a shelf life. They don't last for very long. And so, for example, when you talk about Plato, for example, Plato sets up a new plateau. He replaces the previous sort of Homeric way of doing wisdom with philosophy. So reason all of a sudden becomes the dominant motif for organizing the Greek polity. And that's a way of stabilizing things temporarily. So it's really important not to sort of fix the parasite in Serre's view. So I think he would not agree that with the slogan that you took the photo of, that humanity is parasitical. In a sense, what he would want to ask the question, is humanity parasitical? He wouldn't want to answer it with yes, it is parasitical. Because the question is the dynamics between things flowing and operating reciprocally and creating systems, and things getting sort of reducing to the basic phenomena of a parasitical relation. And with respect to settlement, there's a really interesting discoveries in recent archaeology that settlement was probably a side effect of rituals, because at the very earliest settlements, what you find is traces of the use of alcohol, traces of pits with small amounts of evidence that grain was turned into something alcoholic, or that some alcohol was formed. So probably to produce the quantities of alcohol that were necessary for having the rituals that had grown and become established, all of a sudden you needed to have somebody stay there permanently to make this stuff. And the other thing that's very clear is the health consequences of early settlement were pretty bad. The people who lived in the earliest human settlements were unhealthy, right? And probably, you know, the healthier lifestyle was the more nomadic. So even that can be thought in terms of parasitism. I think so. So yeah. So just, I think just there's a real subtlety to Say's thought, and I think it's the broad ontological rethinking in terms of the science of thermodynamics and information theory that he's really contributing. But I agree with Arpad that he went a little bit mad when he went to California. And, you know.
Very, very briefly, I mean, Paul's, the idea of human life itself and life itself as stretched between the original state A, sun, and state B, total entropy, it makes the entire biological existence on planet Earth a liminality, a decaying liminality, which you know, is pretty cosmic. I just want to chuck in a couple of etymologies. Parasite comes from the Greek parasitos. Sitos means food, and it means sitting next to somebody and stealing their food, like in a McDonald's, which I think is quite nice. But in German, there are two words for parasite: a Schmarotzer, which is somebody who's a scrounger who if you like takes food, but the killer Nazi word for parasite that they use is Schädling. Now, Schädling comes from Schaden, like Schadenfreude, meaning harming. So there's the idea of somebody who just scrounges, like your, you know, somebody comes into your kitchen and eats all your food or something. But the dangerous concept of parasite is this thing that the Jews were identified with, that they were actual, and of course there's a terrifying dark irony in the fact that Jews were killed in the gas chambers using Cyclone B, which was a parasite killer. It was an insecticide and a parasite killer. So there was I don't know how deliberate it was, but it was an extraordinary thing. But I just think it's rather interesting that the way, in one language at least, there are two different sets of connotations of parasite. And of course, the other strange thing that we've become aware of about in a liminal modern age of knowledge is that we've now realized that parasites and bacilli are actually vital to human life. So the actual distinction between healthy and unhealthy, being Schädling or something which is actually life creating and life asserting, has actually got very problematic in science. I mean, if you could kill all the germs in your stomach, you would die. And I think the idea of things that we used to reject as unhealthy being healthy is actually another contribution. Thank you very much.